So now back to Professor Smirnova's presentation, the title of which is, Will the Real Muzhik Please Stand Up? Masculinities and Soviet Political Humor.
Great. Thank you so much for such a generous welcome and biography. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to present. This is very much informed by one of the publications that Justyna talked about, published in Men and Masculinities. So this is work based on my dissertation, but I'm currently working, I've recently published a paper on US political humor, specifically memes during the 2016 presidential election, focused on Trump and Clinton. And I'm working on a new project focused on memes and political humor targeting Trump and Putin, and comparisons about gender and sexuality, and a lot of the themes that I'll be talking about today. So at the end of the talk, I would really love your feedback and sort of suggestions about directions going forward with this type of work. So before I delve into the presentation today, I wanted to begin with some general background information about the subject of my interrogation. The Anecdote is a Russian short-form political joke that was exchanged with great frequency during the Soviet era. Article 58 of the Soviet Penal Code defined political humor as anti-Soviet propaganda. And during Stalin's reign, over 200,000 political prisoners were sent to the Gulag for telling such jokes. Despite being illegal, Russians found ways to exchange these narratives late at night around the kitchen table, sharing their worries and frustrations, but only with those people that they could absolutely trust. These narratives spread far and wide across the Soviet Union. It's important to study the folklore of a people who risk their lives in order to keep these narratives and commentary, in that it reveals something intensely intimate and personal about an insider collective identity. So since it's important for you to understand the form and structure of this joke before we get started, what better way to familiarize you than by starting with a joke? But before I tell you this joke, there are some elements that you must understand in order to understand the joke. So to begin, Marxist doctrine argued that just as society would develop from feudalism into capitalism, that it would eventually progress further into socialism and eventually communism. The Russians were allegedly building communism during the Soviet Union, but at the current stage it was socialist in nature. So the anecdote goes, it's a well-known fact that before communism reaches its final and most perfect form, that it must first pass through a preparatory stage period of socialism. Currently, however, the Soviet Union is in another stage that was not described by Marx. This stage is called alcoholism. So this anecdote highlights and challenges the party rhetoric that the problems of socialism would be eradicated and dealt with during communism by drawing attention to this mainstay of contemporary Russian culture. Alcohol was a coping mechanism that many men particularly used in order to deal with the hardships of the Soviet reality. George Orwell argued that under totalitarian rule, every joke is a tiny revolution. And in the context of the Soviet Union, the exchange of anecdotes undeniably challenged the power and the legitimacy of the Soviet Union. Akin to James Scott's hidden transcripts, which he defines that we need to pay attention not to organized social movements or associated with official organizations, but also the ways that we chip away at power through dragging our feet at work, showing up late, telling jokes, songs, folklore, that many of these things can chip away at the power of these official structures in ways potentially that go unrecognized and are therefore more powerful than officially organized social movements. The story of anti-state resistance is important to explore, but it's important not to it's important to be careful not to characterize these actions as entirely resistant in nature. That in fact, humor in many ways can reify power structures and can reproduce inequalities, such as through the articulation of hegemonic masculinity, which subjugate, excludes, and ostracizes women, gay men, men of color, which Connell calls marginalized and subjugated masculinities. So if you've ever traveled or lived abroad, you probably recognize that humor is not something that translates very easily. You might understand the joke, you might understand the logic that should make it funny, but it doesn't produce the laughter for you the same way it may for insiders. Of all forms of communication, humor is arguably the most reliant upon cooperative participation between the performer and the audience, in that the audience must get the joke in order for it to be successful. The content of the jokes, characters, settings, and objects of critique are drawn from the environment, the cultural shared lexicon, and therefore both the performer and the audience must be fluent in these things in order to understand the logic behind it. Studying jokes of people who risk imprisonment in order to tell them exposes a subversive collective identity or identities, and provides a unique glimpse into the cultural intimacy shaped through shared experiences of state repression. These anecdotes can also shed light upon contemporary protests, such as the protest by Pussy Riot in front of the Church of Christ the Savior. Protests have been more common in post-Soviet space, but participation in these public and outspoken acts of resistance can have very dire consequences, such as imprisonment, exile, and death. Therefore, it's also important to pay attention to these forms of resistance that often go unrecognized and unnoticed by scholarship. So a little bit of background about the anecdote itself. They have a very long history in Russia, dating back to the mid-18th century, though its initial structure and subject matter is very different from the Soviet variety that many have characterized them as different genres. This earlier form took a variety of forms. There was long-form literary works. There were short parables that had humorous endings. Some were fictional, some were not. The Soviet Union combined many of these genres in different ways, producing this short form, orally transmitted structure that was lent itself to exchange and passing. This new form of anecdote was very much tied to the emancipation of the serfs. And in the increased urbanization and industrialization of Russia. Between 1863 and 1913, the number of urban dwellers with peasant backgrounds quadrupled, and increasingly people clustered in major cities. These shifts are important in that this short form anecdote lent itself to passing in stairwells, at work, once people were done working for the day, late at night, around the kitchen table. And these were so popularly exchanged that there were many anecdotes that focused on the telling of anecdotes themselves. So another anecdote, one man yells out, "Number 67," and everybody laughs. The next guy yells out, "Number 52," and everybody laughs even harder. Then someone else yells, "Number 41," and one of the inmates starts laughing so hysterically. He exclaims, "I've never heard that one before." So this pastime was shared by compatriots, solidifying this shared identity of people who understood what these meant, and this idea that we're not going through it alone, that this disjuncture between propaganda and my lived reality is shared by other people, and therefore, as Anderson describes, this imagined community through which anecdotes solidified. So for this study, I conducted a discourse analysis of 1,290 anecdotes that were drawn from 12 compilations published between 1951 and 2010. My broad research questions were: what were the relationships between anecdotes and the Russo-Soviet collectivity? For this particular paper, what kind of gender discourses were used? How are different populations circumscribed by these discourses? I traveled to St. Petersburg and Moscow in order to retrieve these compilations that were housed in archives and National Library. I then translated in order to facilitate coding in vivo. And I also talked to a lot of people about their experiences sharing and hearing anecdotes and how sharing severely diminished since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there were many Russians who argued that outsiders would not understand this cultural exchange, and that you have to have lived through it in order to understand the narratives or understand why they're so important. And to me, I took this as very much evidence that these were a form of hidden transcript that James Scott writes about that are policed from these outsiders. Pictured on this slide is one of these coding maps. I coded 158 codes that were then coded into larger, eight larger codes. So you can notice from this tree-like coding structure how these fed into some of the broader theoretical arguments in my dissertation and in these published works. So, my analysis overall found that Anecdotes communicated a Russian nationalist identity that contrasted with the supranational Soviet identity, rejecting this communist vision of an identity that would erase identity markers such as gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and class in some ways. So instead, Anecdotes challenged this discourse by highlighting inconsistencies between the propaganda and the lived realities of the people, but also reified these boundaries between these different populations. Despite the communist ideal of treating all men and women of different nationalities as equals, Soviet family and nationalities policies prescribed different responsibilities and treatments for men and women and people of different nationalities. So these two ideals of equality and difference came into odds with one another. So in this talk, I will discuss how Anecdotes reveal a crisis in Soviet and Russian masculinity by expressing multiple masculinities in dialogue with one another, and by contributing to a hierarchy of cultural citizenship by defining different racial, gendered, and ethnic groups as others. The focus of this research is both upon the objects and the context of the jokes, but also very much the joke tellers themselves. How do the sharing of these jokes reveal the crises in their own experiences? And this is fundamental to critical discourse analysis, which focuses on both text and the context in which texts are circulated. So the process of defining a nation, a history, and a vision for future often fosters national ethnocentrism and chauvinism. In order to construct a national myth and identity, men as soldiers, heroes, visionaries, and political leaders are elevated to symbols of the collectivity and the nation's historical legacy, while women and ethnic others are often constructed as others. Therefore, nationalism is an important site for accomplishing masculinity, as West and Zimmerman and Connell have all discussed. Such was particularly the case in Soviet Russia, where the Communist Party of the Soviet Union argued that once pure communism would be realized, Russian, Ukrainian, and other Soviet figures would be replaced by a new Soviet man. This was the ideal Soviet citizen who superseded any cultural, ethnic, or religious markers, and brilliant and strong, excelled at everything that he set his mind to, including the realization of communism. This archetype was presented commonly in Soviet propaganda, and yet was viewed with skepticism by many of the Russian and the Soviet people, and that this was an unrealistic ideal and that did not map onto their own experiences. And in response to this unrealistic propaganda ideal, Zinoviev argues that the Soviet system produced the opposite of what was intended, dubbing the resulting anti-hero Homo Sovieticus as a man who lacks ambition and respect for work, who blindly is obedient to the party, takes advantage of collective labor, and drinks heavily to cope with his feelings of impotence and inability to realize this ideal of the new Soviet man. It is this Homo Sovieticus that is described in many of these Soviet anecdotes, as the opening joke about pervasive alcoholism demonstrates. Another anecdote in many Soviet anecdotes, another anecdote that similarly describes the struggle with alcoholism is described as followed. So this is based on Chapayev, who is a Red Army hero of the Russian Civil War and is a common figure in many of the Russian anecdotes. So asking Chapayev, Vasily Ivanovich, can you drink a liter? Of course I can. And two? Yep. And how about a bucket? No, Petka. Only Lenin can do that. So the ultimate goal of masculinity is to drink as opposed to realize communism. The party renders the ideal Soviet man as cultured, healthy, and strong, yet Russian men often disrupted this image through their own construction of masculinities. Soviet anecdote narratives express the cynicism towards these unrealistic party expectations by focusing on how the Soviet efforts were often about achieving the extraordinary at the expense of the ordinary. And so this conflict of outward presentation versus the experience internally is expressed in this anecdote. Yuri Gagarin, daughter, answers the door. When will your parents home? The stranger asks. Well, Daddy is orbiting the Earth, so he'll be back this evening. But Mommy is out shopping for butter, so we don't know when she'll be back. So this anecdote highlights this focus on the extraordinary at the expense of the ordinary. Another anecdote expands upon this critique of the party ideals and these Soviet ideals of Russian masculinity in particular. Armenian Radio asks, is the common Soviet man free? Our reply, of course he's free. He rides around on his dick and goes wherever he wants. So the Soviet rhetoric portrays the Russian man as a citizen as one of the most powerful nations in the world, and yet he is confined to the boundaries of the USSR in his travels, and his only conquests are sexual in nature. As such, he is powerful in name, but powerless in practice. Ideologically, gender equality was requisite to the accomplishment of the communist mission. In fact, there were activists who argued that women were the most oppressed of the proletariats and therefore should be mobilized as levers for the rest of society. Despite this perspective, Soviet rhetoric promoted a traditional family structure, which in turn solidified this patriarchal public-private division of labor. And it makes this appear as a natural fact. The naturalization of gender relations was also produced this complementary figure to the new Soviet man of the new Soviet woman, who was to be both a full-time worker as well as a wife and mother. In the wake of major population declines in the 1920s, caused by war, revolution, and increased contraception use, Soviet propaganda emphasized women's roles in saving the nation through procreation and their dual role as both worker and housewife. This private familiar strategy encouraged women to save men and protect them from their bad behaviors in terms of alcoholism, overeating, physical immobility, and excuse men from house work and taking care of children. This weak family breadwinner model credited men as the official providers of the household, even though 92% of women were employed in the 1970s and the 1980s and were significantly more educated than men. This justified inequalities in the homes. Research found that women did typically between 60 and 70% of housework, and they still earned about 30% less at work. So these competing requirements between domestic and occupational duties produce this role strain for many women. The Russian male perspective of Anecdotes defines women primarily according to one of three roles: the housewife, the slut, or the scapegoat. The scapegoat is a woman who deserves violence committed against her. These roles are interconnected, discursively constructing women as unwelcome in the workplace and encouraged to serve the needs of men, that they are either manipulative or promiscuous, exclusively seeking power through their sexuality, and deserving of violence committed against them and or responsible for men's failings or the nation's failings, as is it equated with men. These narratives reify women's subordinate roles in the national imagery despite claims of equality, focusing on the incongruity between this party propaganda of equality and the lived experiences. The role of women as homemakers who must attend to household chores and the needs of men are described in the following anecdote. Your husband was telling me the other day he lives like a dog. It's true. He comes home with dirty feet, sits in front of the fireplace, and waits to be fed. In this narrative, the woman is constructed as the caretaker of men, cooking and cleaning and serving her husband or lover sexually. Further, the joke implies that it is unnatural for a man to be a dog, and that in fact it is the woman who turns him into a dog by treating him as such. Thus, it blames the woman for turning the men into something subhuman. National rhetoric was able to downplay or ignore women's contributions to the party by only paying attention to how they served men, as evidenced in the following anecdote. Armenian Radio City M asks, why aren't women accepted into the army? Our reply, because of the way they obey the order to lie down. So women were excluded from the armed forces following the Civil War, which elevated men's statuses to the sole defenders of the USSR. Schoberg and Gentry argue that even when women were allowed to serve, that they were often constructed as only serving the needs of men in terms of their husbands or their sons. Female power is singularly understood as sexual. Unlike those narratives that portray women as simple-minded and helpless, anecdotes about sex portray them as powerful, but only by using their sexuality. In this anecdote, a drunk man is on a bus filled with women. He starts to yell out, "Those in front of me are fools, and those behind me are sluts." Silence. At the next bus stop, he repeats, "Those in front of me are fools, and those behind me are sluts." Silence. Again, the next bus stop, he says, "Those in front of me are fools, and those behind me are sluts." Finally, a woman replies to him, "How can you say that? I've been married for 20 years to the same man, and I've never cheated on him." "Well then, you must be a fool. Move to the front of the bus." So this anecdote presents women's dichotomous choice between being morally superior and compliant, or being deviant yet powerful through using her sexuality. So by choosing this route, she will be blamed for her improperness. And so the next way we see that the Russian men are centered in the anecdote perspective is the focus on ethnic and national and religious others. This cultural mythology of heroes, victims, and fools uses these outgroups by constructing the Russian men as often the victims and the villains and fools as these ethnic others. Constructing ethnic others or political enemies as sexually inept or overly promiscuous similarly dehumanizes them and justifies discrimination against them, and using a sexual and gendered basis for this construction. The Bolsheviks sought to create a federation among the Soviets that was national in form but socialist in content, but they wanted to retain Russian power and dominance. As a result, the Soviet nationalities policy oscillated between Russification and ethnophilia, enacting assimilationist policies while simultaneously institutionalizing ethnic identity through the ethnic republics, passport identification policies, the promotion of native language schools, and allowing the media to be disseminated in local languages. The instituted passport policy forced individuals to identify with a minority ethnic group, and that this was recorded during most economic and official exchanges. For example, in the following anecdote, this policy was criticized. "Once communism is achieved, will passports still list our nationalities? Of course not. But it will list your nationality under socialism." The Soviets believed that they were immune to racism, that it only occurred in capitalist or imperialist countries that had slavery, racialized slavery. Soviet anecdotes reveal this tension between communist and Soviet ideals in addition to these racist sentiments pervasive amongst the Russian people. Although the Soviet Union hosted over 100 ethnic groups, it was notable that in my sample there were only 19 ethnic groups that appeared in these jokes, and that they're clustered predominantly into the three groups that I will discuss today. The existence of jokes about a particular ethnic group can often reveal how a group is constructed as a threat to this centralized identity, and so that they are constructed as others or dehumanized in such ways to legitimate violence or to delegitimate or challenge the successes that they've achieved. Of these 19 national and ethnic groups mentioned in the sample, Jews occupied over a quarter of these anecdotes. They were a very small proportion of the Soviet Union at the time, less than 1%, but yet they were highly visible due to their educational and occupational achievements, as well as their ability to immigrate from the Soviet Union. They were considered a national group, so it was listed on their passport that Jewish was their national identity, and this occurred even before Israel was established in 1948. As such, we see quite a bit of these jokes focusing or dehumanizing Jews in various ways. So this first anecdote reveals some of these frustrations. Really, those Jews, for themselves, they invented Zionism, and for the others, Marxism. I'll explain these in a moment. On the front lines, a commander yells out, "For the Soviet motherland, for our beloved Stalin," and his soldiers charge into battle, all except for one soldier, a Jew, who hides in the bushes. After the attack, the commander tracks him down and scolds him. "You bastard, pussy, coward." The Jew mutters to himself, "It's better to be a coward for 5 minutes than a corpse the rest of your life." So the first narrative expresses the opinion that Jews were responsible for the Soviet experiment, given that Marx was a Jew, and that they could leave once their experiment had gone awry by immigrating to Israel. And so in this way, they're constructed as both manipulative and selfish. The second constructs the Jew in a similar fashion, trying to escape, but this time through cowardice and manipulation. There's also this second meaning that might be saying that it's better to face anti-Semitism alive than dead. Anti-Semitism was rampant at both individual and institutionalized levels in the Soviet Union, and Jews were by casting Jews as sexually inferior or inept is a way of justifying this violence committed in a variety of forms. Chaim, someone is fucking your wife on the woodpile. Which woodpile? The one to the left or the right? The one to the left. Well, that's not my woodpile. So here the Jew either cannot or chooses not to protect his wife from another man. He is more concerned with his possession, such as woodpiles, than his family. By casting Jews in such economic or emasculated ways, Russians could blame this group rather than the Soviet state, which privileged Russians in a number of socio-political ways. This also helped them manage their masculinity by constructing other groups as manipulative or greedy or impotent, such as the Jew, or hypersexual and crude, as we will see with the Georgian. So there were few jokes about the Georgian before the death of Stalin in 1953, in part because they were not a very visible group. They were a highly nationalist nation state in the south, whom Russians had very little contact. After his death, they raised a ban against private enterprise, which allowed small businesses to reopen while the state continued to control banks, foreign trade, and large industries. This was when Russians often had first exposures to Georgians and other southern nationalities who were able to sell fruits and flowers for profit in local markets. Although less than a percentage of Georgians participated in this enterprise, they became this visible group and this image that they were profiting at a time when Russians were struggling. And so in such a way, we see that they're constructed as hypersexual and crude as a way to diminish this perceived success. So the first joke. In a church, a Georgian prays for money to buy a car. Next to him, a Russian prays for half a liter of vodka. Finally, the Georgian gets annoyed and gives the Russian 10 rubles. "Listen, get yourself a bottle and don't bother God with your trifles." So the George success and prosperity is attributed to his exploitation of Russians and their hard times, and thereby villainizes their success. We also see the perpetuation of the stereotype of the Russian as the drunk, who's only concerned with vodka, but who is ultimately still a victim in this narrative, as opposed to the villain. And here we see this hypersexualization. A Georgian is making love to his bride but cannot get it in. He tries and tries until he's half dead with exhaustion and his cock is raw. Finally, he gets it in. "Phew," he says, wiping the sweat from his face. "I didn't know you were still a virgin." "Are you joking?" replies the bride. "Did no one ever tell you not to throw a woman on a bed before she has had time to remove her tights?" And then another joke, which is very parallel to a lot of US prison humor. A bunch of Georgians are taking a shower. Suddenly, one of them drops a bar of soap. "So much for taking a shower today," says one of them. So the rhetoric of this anecdote allows for the reinterpretation of the social group as greedy and manipulative, but also hypersexual and crude. This party rhetoric valorized this ascetic lifestyle in the name of the higher cause of communism, and given that Georgians were perceived to be profiting, that they were blamed for not living this lifestyle. And this hypersexualization also otherizes a population and justifies violence or exclusion in a variety of ways. And finally, the Chukchi. So, anecdotes about the Chukchi might be grouped under ethnic humor, given that they are an actual population. But yet, many of these narratives are much more similar to the Fool, or in their literal interpretation of party propaganda, that they're able to see things, see the disjunctures between propaganda and reality. The Chukchi mock Soviet power in very astute and unassuming ways, oftentimes by revealing this inherent contradictions between official discourse and these lived realities. They were this geographically isolated population that lived in the furthest northeastern tip of Siberia, far from where most Russians had ever traveled. And therefore, they were constructed as illiterate and cut off from the general social world. Anecdotes about Chukchi often focus upon these frigid conditions that they lived as Eskimos in the Arctic, as seen in this following anecdote. A Chukcha wants to buy a refrigerator. What do you need that for, the salesperson says. You live in Siberia. To warm up during the winter. Imagine how nice it would be when it's -40 out and it's only 0 in the fridge. Such jokes act in a similar fashion as these previous outgroups, as a means of bolstering in-group identity, of the Russians being a comparatively intelligent people. But this Chukcha fool is more than just an outsider. He's a political commentary. Similar to Zimmel's stranger, the Chukcha has the social distance from Russians in order to see and say things that Russians cannot. As a result, Chukchi are able to highlight the illogical and irrationalities of the USSR in a more explicit or direct manner. The following anecdote offers Chukchi's literal interpretation of party discourse in order to highlight these propagandistic portrayals. A Soviet journalist interviews a Chukcha. Could you tell us briefly how you lived before the October Revolution? Hungry and cold. And how do you live now? Hungry and cold, but with a deep sense of gratitude. Russians were socialized by textbooks and Soviet propaganda which told them how things were in their lives, which often did not map onto what they were actually experiencing. So this highlights how little the situation has changed despite this outward presentation. The following anecdote challenges also this imagery of alleged intelligence of the Soviet Union, and is a joke that continues to get told in contemporary Russia. A Chukcha applies for membership to the prestigious Union of Soviet Writers. He is asked what literature has influenced his work. Have you read Pushkin? No. Have you read Dostoevsky? No. Can you read it all? The Chukcha, offended, replies, Chukcha not reader, Chukcha writer. This anecdote was so popular amongst Russians, it was found in every single anthology that I looked through, and continues to be said today about the absence of intelligence or credentials, or the mission of the Soviet Union about not reading the great works in the rest of the world, particularly because of censorship and isolation during the Soviet Union, and today still used as a critique in modern day Russian. Given this extensive censorship, we see this responsibility, this response is often used as a singular form, Chukcha not reader, Chukcha writer, in many social settings. So we see in summary that the Communist Party argued the Soviet Union would produce this new Soviet man and woman who would embody the values and aspirations of the party. And yet, as time passed, it seemed obvious that this realization was not coming about. The concept of homo sovieticus, the embodiment of the adverse results of Soviet policies, seem more accurate and is reflected in many of these anecdotes. We see in one anecdote in particular, the government pretends to pay us, and we pretend to work. So we see this opposite of the new Soviet man, who is indifferent to social life, who is blindly obedient to the party, but drinks heavily to cope with the hardships that he experiences, is often reflected the experiences, or more accurately than this new Soviet man ideal itself. And so in the humor, we see how Russian men are privileged in many ways. This centered perspective, very much as victims of the Soviet state that did not realize these things, did not provide all of the achievements that they alleged to provide, and in many ways coped with their emasculation and their this crisis in masculinity by subjugating women and legitimating violence against them, as well as excluding ethnic and national others, constructing them as villains, and this justification for why the Soviet ideals were not being realized, and justifying their exclusion or violence committed against them. And thank you.